Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going way back in time to ancient Rome to explore the rise of the Roman Republic. We've got all sorts of sources here covering everything from Romulus and Remus to political assassinations to the Punic Wars. It should be quite a ride through, you know, epic battles, legendary figures, and a system of government that honestly still has a big impact on us today.
It really is amazing when you think about it. How did this small group of villages along the Tiber River end up as the dominant force in the entire Mediterranean world?
Well, let's dive right in. I mean, I think we've all heard the story of Romulus and Remus, right? Those twin brothers raised by a she-wolf destined to found Rome. It's such a captivating story.
It really is, yeah. And the myth itself tells us a lot about those core Roman values. But if we dig into the archaeology, it actually paints a different picture.
Oh,
Yeah, it points to a much more gradual emergence of Rome. Think about small settlements, maybe around 1000 to 800 BCE, slowly coming together over time and merging into a larger community.
so less about a dramatic she-wolf rescue and more about a slow and steady evolution, huh?
Exactly.
Fascinating. But before Rome takes center stage, there's another group we got to talk about, the Etruscans. They were a major force in Italy before Rome, right?
Oh, absolutely. The
Yeah.
Etruscans were a powerful civilization, advanced agriculture, incredible metalworking skills, and they had this vast trade network that spanned the entire Mediterranean.
Oh,
They were connected with the Greeks, the Phoenicians. Can you imagine the cultural exchange,
yeah.
the bustling ports?
I can almost hear the marketplace now. So, how did the Etruscans in these early Roman settlements first interact? I mean, their paths must have crossed at some point.
Well, as the Etruscans expanded southward, they inevitably ran into those developing Roman communities. And this early interaction, it really foreshadows the power dynamics that would come to define the entire region.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. It turns out the Romans weren't big fans of having kings.
Not at all.
So in the 6th century BCE, they decide to make a change. A big change.
You're right. A group of Roman aristocrats, they lead a revolt against those Etruscan kings. And that's how the Roman Republic is born. Power shifts from a single monarch to a body called the Senate.
The Senate. And who exactly makes up the Senate?
Well, it was mostly those influential aristocrats.
Gotcha. So it's a complete power shift from one person to this council of elites. This feels like a huge turning point.
Absolutely. This moment is pivotal. It sets the stage for everything that follows. Rome's unique political development, its eventual dominance, it all stems from the establishment of the Republic.
Okay, so they've got this new republic, they're starting to expand, but how does this system actually work? It all comes down to SPQR, right? The Senate and the Roman people.
Exactly.
But I have a feeling that this whole power-sharing thing wasn't always smooth sailing.
You're right about that. Roman Constitution, it wasn't a formal document like we might think of today. It was more like this collection of unwritten rules, customs, and traditions, and it was constantly evolving.
I see, I see.
But at the heart of it all was this constant tension between two groups, the patricians and the plebeians.
Okay, so you've got the patricians, the wealthy elite who are essentially calling the shots, and then you've got the plebeians, the everyday folks.
Exactly. The patricians, they held most of the power. They were the military leaders. They dominated the Senate. They controlled legal knowledge. The plebeians, while they were citizens, they had very little political influence. Can you imagine how frustrating that would
I
be?
can't even imagine.
And it led to what we call the struggle of the orders.
The struggle of the orders.
Yep. It was this centuries-long conflict between the plebeians and the patricians. The plebeians, they wanted a bigger say in how things were run, and they were willing to fight for it.
So it's like this constant back and forth for power. It must have taken a lot of courage to stand up to those in charge.
Mhm.
What did the struggle of the orders actually look like? Like, what were they doing?
Well, we have to remember that the plebeians were the ones who made up the army, right? They were the backbone of Rome's strength. So in 494 BCE, they did something pretty drastic. They staged a walkout.
A walkout.
Yeah. Basically, they refused to serve in the army until their demands were met. They wanted more representation.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful statement.
Mm.
So what happened? Did it work?
It did. This bold move led to the creation of a new position, the tribunes.
The tribunes, what do they do?
These were elected officials who actually had the power to veto laws that were harmful to the plebeians. It was a major step towards creating a more balanced system.
It was a big win for the people.
Ah.
But I bet they didn't stop there.
Oh, no, they didn't stop. They pushed for something even bigger. They wanted Roman law to be codified, and that led to the laws of the 12 tables.
Okay, the laws of the 12 table. Tell me more about that.
Well, these laws were actually inscribed on 12 bronze tablets and displayed publicly for everyone to see. This meant that both the patricians and the plebeians were, at least in theory, supposed to be protected equally under the law. No more secret rules.
It's like transparency. Everyone can see what the laws were, no matter who they were. That's incredible.
It was a huge victory. It really shows how, even back then, they understood the importance of a fair and transparent legal system. It was a testament to the power of demanding fairness and representation.
It's amazing to see how this struggle shaped the Roman Republic. But let's focus in on some of those key players. We've got the consuls, the quaestors, the praetors. Remind me what those guys all did.
Well, the consuls, remember, they were like the top dogs, those powerful executives elected each year.
Right.
Then you had the quaestors. They were appointed by the consuls, and they were responsible for the treasury and investigations, like the financial watchdogs and detectives of the Roman Republic.
So making sure everything was running smoothly
Yeah,
and no one was up to no good.
exactly.
And what about the praetors? What did they do?
Think of them as judges. They were responsible for administering justice, especially when the consuls were busy with other matters, off leading armies or dealing with problems in the territories. They could even command armies and govern provinces if needed.
Sounds like a pretty important job. But let's talk about the real power behind the scenes, the Senate. They were the ones really calling the shots, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Senate was like the bedrock of the Roman Republic. They provided stability and continuity, and their influence was immense.
I bet.
They controlled public spending, influenced appointments. They could even appoint a dictator in times of crisis.
Whoa, talk about power.
And even though their decrees weren't technically legally binding, most magistrates followed their recommendations. The Senate, dominated by those patricians we talked about, they really shaped Roman politics for centuries.
It sounds like things were already pretty intense within Rome itself. But they had some major conflicts brewing with other powers, right? We can't talk about the Roman Republic without talking about the Punic Wars.
Absolutely. The Punic Wars were a defining moment for Rome. These were brutal conflicts between Rome and Carthage, another rising power in the Mediterranean. And these wars, they played a huge role in shaping Rome's destiny.
Okay, so set the scene for me. What were they fighting over? What was at stake in these wars?
Well, the First Punic War, it was all about control of Sicily.
Sicily.
Yeah, it was this prime location in the Mediterranean. Both Rome and Carthage wanted to control those lucrative sea trade routes. And this war, it dragged on for over 20 years. Can you imagine? Both sides suffered heavy losses. But in the end, Rome came out on top.
Wow. 20 years of war. That's a
Uh-huh.
long time.
Yeah.
But that was just the beginning, right?
Oh, yeah. Things really heated up in the Second Punic War. We're talking about Hannibal Barca, one of the greatest military commanders of all time.
Oh, yeah. Hannibal. That's the guy who marched his army over the Alps with elephants, right?
That's him. Hannibal came up with this super daring plan to attack Rome from the north. He crossed the Alps, those towering, treacherous mountains, with a massive army. And get this, he brought war elephants. I mean, the logistics of it all.
It's mind-boggling. What did the Romans think of all this?
Well, they were completely caught off guard, that's for sure. Hannibal handed the Roman legions defeat after defeat. The Battle of Cannae. Oof. Hannibal completely outmaneuvered the Roman forces, who vastly outnumbered him. It was a crushing loss for Rome.
It sounds like things were looking pretty grim for Rome.
It was a dark time for the Republic. But those moments of adversity, they reveal a lot about character. And Rome proved its resilience. They found new leadership under a brilliant general named Scipio Africanus.
So Scipio, he turned the tide.
He did. He took the fight to Carthage, forcing Hannibal to return home to defend his own city. The decisive battle. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Scipio's tactics were brilliant, his leadership was inspiring, and Hannibal was defeated. Carthage had to surrender. And from then on, Rome was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. What a comeback story.
Wow, what a story. But I have to imagine that all these wars, all this expansion, it had to have some repercussions back in Rome, didn't it? I mean, not everyone was happy about all these victories, right?
That's a great point. While Rome was conquering vast territories, there were problems brewing at home. The late Republic was a time of deep social and economic inequalities, political violence. It was a really unstable time.
So all those victories were masking some pretty serious internal problems.
Exactly. Many plebeians, those soldiers who fought in the Roman legions, they were coming home to poverty. They couldn't afford land. And meanwhile, the wealthy elite, they were amassing huge estates, often on land taken from the very people they had conquered.
That doesn't sound good. What happened next?
Well, That growing gap between the rich and poor. It led to social unrest, calls for reform, and that's where two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, enter the picture.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
They were true champions of the people, trying to create a more equitable society.
But they were going up against some very powerful interests, right?
They were. Both Tiberius and Gaius, they served as tribunes, and they fought passionately to redistribute land, to help the poor and landless. But their efforts were met with fierce resistance from the wealthy elite, who, of course, wanted to hold on to their power and privilege.
It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. You've got these idealistic reformers challenging the corrupt establishment. So what happened to them?
Sadly, their efforts ended in violence. Tiberius was murdered in 133 BCE, along with hundreds of his supporters.
Oh, wow.
And his brother Gaius, he met a similar fate about a decade later, either killed by a mob or forced to commit suicide because of the Senate's opposition.
It's a reminder that even those with the best intentions can become victims of political violence.
It is. And the deaths of the Gracchi brothers. They unleashed a cycle of violence that would plague the late Republic. It marked a turning point, showing just how deep those divisions were and how fragile the Roman political system had become.
It really does feel like Rome was teetering on the edge of a cliff.
It was. The old order was crumbling and new forces were rising to challenge it. One of those forces was a military leader named Gaius Marius.
Gaius Marius, okay.
He's going to be a pivotal figure in the story that unfolds.
Sounds like someone we need to get to know.
He's fascinating. Marius, he wasn't a patrician. He came from the equestrian class, sometimes called the Knights.
The Knights, okay.
He was a brilliant general, popular with his legions, especially after his victories against the Germanic tribes.
Sounds like he was a man of the people.
He was. And he used his popularity to push for reforms. He wanted to grant land to his veteran soldiers. This made him even more beloved by the common people, but it also made him some enemies among the elite.
Oh, I can see how that would cause some friction.
Absolutely. Marius was elected consul an unbelievable 7 times.
7 times. Wow.
His career showed that military success could pave the way for political power. And, in many ways, he paved the way for guys like Julius Caesar, who would come to dominate the late Republic.
Speaking of challenges to Roman power, there's another story we need to touch on. The slave revolt, led by Spartacus. That must have been terrifying for the Roman elite.
It was. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus led a slave rebellion that shook Roman society to its core. Tens of thousands of escaped slaves. They even defeated several Roman legions. Imagine the fear that must have gripped those in power.
Talk about turning the tables. It must have felt like the world was upside down.
It did. And while Spartacus's rebellion was eventually crushed, it exposed Rome's vulnerabilities. Even the mighty Roman Republic could be challenged. There were deep social tensions that could erupt at any moment.
So a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires have their weaknesses.
Exactly. And it's out of this chaos, right, that we see the rise of 2 key figures, Pompey and Crassus.
Oh yeah, Pompey and Crassus.
Pompey, he gained prominence by putting down a rebellion in Spain. And Crassus, well, he was the one who brutally crushed Spartacus's slave revolt. These military victories made them political stars.
So they were rising in power and influence.
They were. And that leads us to the first triumvirate.
Ah, yes. The first triumvirate. This uneasy alliance between Pompey, Crassus, and, of course, the up-and-coming Julius Caesar. What a power trio.
It was. In 60 BCE, these 3 incredibly ambitious and powerful men joined forces. They agreed to share power and help each other achieve their goals. It was a brilliant strategic move. They wanted to control Roman politics.
But history shows us that these alliances built on ambition often have a way of falling apart. What happened to the first triumvirate?
Well, just like you said, conflict was inevitable. Crassus met a dramatic end on the battlefield. And that left Pompey and Caesar.
Oh, no.
Yeah, just the 2 of them. And their rivalry, it would set the stage for one of the most tumultuous periods in Roman history.
It sounds like things are about to get really interesting. And that brings us to Julius Caesar, a name that has become synonymous with Roman power and ambition.
Gaius Julius Caesar, a truly complex and fascinating figure.
He was?
A patrician by birth, a brilliant orator, a cunning politician, and of course, a military genius.
He sounds larger than life.
He was, and incredibly popular with the people. They loved his charisma. They admired his willingness to challenge those traditional elites.
He knew how to play the game.
Oh, he did. But Caesar's ambitions, they would eventually lead him down a dangerous path.
How so?
Well, his conquest of Gaul, what we know today as France, brought him immense wealth and military glory. His legions were fiercely loyal to him, and his popularity back home in Rome, it just soared.
So he was a military hero and a political rock star.
Exactly. But his growing power, and let's be honest, his blatant disregard for the Senate's authority, it put him on a collision course with those who were afraid of him.
And I bet they were plenty afraid.
Oh, they were. The tensions between Caesar and Pompey, they just kept escalating. And eventually it erupted into a full-blown civil war.
And that brings us to one of the most famous moments in Roman history, the crossing of the Rubicon.
Caesar standing at the Rubicon River, defying the Senate,
Yeah.
marching his legions into Italy.
Yeah. It's a powerful image. It was a turning point, a gamble that could either make him the master of Rome or lead to his downfall.
He went all in. So what happened next?
Well, the civil war that followed, it was brutal. Caesar's military genius, the loyalty of his legions, it was too much for Pompey. Pompey was defeated, and eventually he was assassinated in Egypt.
Wow. So Caesar emerged victorious from the civil war. But that's not the end of his story, right? Because now Cleopatra enters the scene.
Yes, Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt.
Talk about a plot twist. Their story is like something out of a movie.
It is. So Caesar, he arrives in Egypt, and he finds himself caught in the middle of a power struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III.
It sounds like a messy situation. It was. But amidst all this chaos, Caesar and Cleopatra formed a powerful alliance, one that was both political and personal.
Okay, so we've got a love affair,
Yep.
and the fate of empires hanging in the balance. It's incredible. So what happened next?
Well, Caesar's legions, they threw their support behind Cleopatra. They defeated Ptolemy's forces in a decisive battle. Cleopatra became the sole ruler of Egypt, and her alliance with Caesar, well, it ensured her kingdom's independence.
It's amazing how these personal relationships can have such a huge impact on history.
They can. And Caesar and Cleopatra's relationship, it went far beyond just politics. They even had a son together, Caesarion. Imagine the scandal.
A love affair, a child, empires hanging in the balance. It's an incredible story. So Caesar, he returns to Rome, a conqueror, a lover, and a father. But he wasn't just content to sit back and relax, right? He was also a reformer. He wanted to change Roman society.
You're absolutely right. Caesar wasn't just a conqueror. He was a visionary. He understood that Rome had problems, and they needed to be fixed if the Republic was going to survive. So he tackled all sorts of issues. Debt, taxation, land distribution. He even reformed the calendar.
Wow, he sounds like a busy guy.
He was. He created the Julian calendar, which, with a few adjustments, is still the calendar we use today.
Mind-blowing. His influence is still felt in the modern world. What was the thinking behind these reforms? What was he hoping to achieve?
Caesar was trying to create a more stable and equitable society. He wanted to strengthen Rome from within, but his ambition, his accumulation of power, it would ultimately lead to his downfall.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it all came to a very dramatic end on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, the day Julius Caesar was assassinated.
The Ides of March. Talk about a day that went down in history.
It did. On that day, Caesar, who had been declared dictator for life, was assassinated by a group of senators who feared his growing power and what they saw as his disregard for Republican traditions.
It's such a dramatic moment. Who were these assassins? Why did they do it?
Well, the conspiracy was led by Brutus and Cassius, two well-respected senators. And get this, they had once been allies of Caesar.
No way.
Yep. Their motives were complex. Part of it was this belief that they were saving the Republic from tyranny. But there were also personal grudges, fear of Caesar's ambition. It's a very complicated story.
That sounds like it.
Yeah.
So Caesar's assassination, it must have thrown Rome into complete chaos.
Right.
What happened next?
It did. The Republic, already weakened by all those internal struggles, was plunged into yet another round of civil wars. And the big question, who would fill the power vacuum left by Caesar's death? Well, one of the contenders was a young man named Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and heir.
Octavian, okay, so he's going to play a major role in the story of Rome.
He is. Octavian was only 19 years old when Caesar was assassinated, but he was a shrewd politician. He knew how to navigate the dangerous world of Roman politics.
Sounds like he inherited some of Caesar's political skills.
He did. Octavian, he formed alliances, he eliminated rivals, he was very strategic. And to really solidify his power, well, he did something pretty bold. He teamed up with two of Caesar's most powerful lieutenants,
Okay, who were they?
Mark Antony and Lepidus.
Okay, so now we've got the second triumvirate, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. And together, they're going to decide the fate of Rome. Well, this has been an incredible journey. It's been amazing to explore how this civilization evolved, how it shaped the world, and how its legacy continues to influence us today.
I agree.
It's been an absolute pleasure exploring ancient Rome with you.
And a big thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into ancient Rome. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering all the incredible stories that history has to offer.